Well, good morning, everybody. How is everybody this morning? Oh, boy, sound pretty weak. Pretty weak, sir. I don't know. I tell you what, I think a little bit of jumping jacks, maybe, a couple push-ups. Look, I'm very happy to be here this morning. This, as General Ham said, is the Creative Adaptive Source Selection Solutions panel. Now, when you think about it, as I was thinking about this, when I look and see the rest of what is up there today, this is like Stephen Covey would say, who wrote the big book, 7 Habits of Successful People. This is habit number 2. Begin with the end in mind. Because everything can be done correctly, but if you don't get this part right and get through source selection and get the contract, it's a lot of wasted effort. And quite frankly, as I said, beginning with the end in mind, this is going to be followed by a panel on operationalizing requirements generation by my colleague Bill Phillips, and then leading the requirements process by Dick Formica. So, you know, we're doing the last part first. We're going to get the requirements piece later, and then you're going to hear a little bit later about the funding from Karen Dyson. But I'm happy to be here this morning. I'm Jeff Sorensen. As General Simpson said, this is trying to understand the entire process. And the panel members today to my left are Ms. Chris Mendoza. She has over 30 years of acquisition experience and is currently the Executive Director and Principal Assistant responsible for contracting at the Army Contracting Command in Warren. Her primary duties are to advise the TACOM LCMC CG on the total acquisition process from policy development to compliance, and review to contract management to associated contract support. In her capacity, she directs more than 700 civilian and military personnel located at 6 geographic locations who administer active contracts in excess of $37 billion. To my right, to your left, John Tesoff is the Principal Assistant responsible for contracting in Winchester, the Park Wind for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Director of Contracting. As the Park, John provides acquisition business advice and oversight to the Contingency Transatlantic Division, the Humphreys Engineer Center Support Activity, the Engineering Research and Development Center, the Army Geospatial Center, and the Huntsville Engineering and Support Center. He manages executions ranging from $3 to $5 billion annually in contracts and obligations. Mr. Chavakin has 13 years of experience as a professional staff member and was a VP of AT&T Government Services before joining the Professional Services Council, which is the principal trade association of the government professional and technical services industry. As the Executive VP and Counsel at the Professional Services Council, Alan is responsible for the association's legislative and regulatory responsibility policy and activities. He is also a founding member and continuing leader of the Federal Contracting Industries Acquisition Reform Working Group, which was established in 1993. Still working at that one. And finally, to the right, you've already heard him speak, Mr. Tim Callahan, who served for almost 30 years in the U.S. Air Force, culminating his career as the Deputy Director at the Warner Robins Air Logistics Center Contracting Directorate, and is now the Defense Contracting Management Agency Executive Director for Contracts. His primary responsibilities include overseeing DCMA contract administration policy and processes to equip and train the more than 11,000 civilian and military personnel with the mission support tools they need to support the warfighter. So as you can see, we have a broad spectrum of capabilities here, not only across the Army with Ms. Mendoza and Mr. Tesoff, but also from DCMA, as well as industry perspective. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Mendoza for her comments.
So, good morning. Yesterday, when I was on my way here, I was thinking that I would get here and just kind of say whatever I wanted to say. I mean, within reason, because the boss is here, of course. But just tell you a little bit about what we're doing at ACC Warren and how we're handling source selections and things like that. And then I saw you posted the slide about it's attributional. And I thought, oh, that's kind of a judgy word, so I better be a little bit more careful about what I say. But in this whole room, I know most of you. I mean, I've either worked for you or with you, or I'm working for you, or I'm working with you right now. So, so you've all talked to me. You know I have kind of an open door policy. So even after this panel is over, please don't hesitate to contact me. I do have an open door policy. I'm not there a lot, but still, I enjoy the communication with industry. So compliant contracts at the speed of war. So that's the theme of this, and I was thinking about that as well. And, you know, as General Sorensen said, I have over 30 years' experience, so I know what contracting not at the speed of war is, and I know what contracting at the speed of war is. If you have less than 15 years of government civil experience or military experience, you've been contracting at the speed of war. All that time, you don't know anything different. That's what we've been doing. And we've been pedaling as hard as we can, you know, during all that time to get things going and get things right. Sometimes it really works well. Sometimes it, you know, we get things fast, but it doesn't work so well. And sometimes we just kind of miss the boat on things. We're trying to learn our lessons and we're trying to get better. So I think that's what today is all about. I want to let you know what lessons we're learning and what we continue to learn and what we're trying to do as far as putting those into practical use. So we're going to be talking about adaptive source selections and a little bit about what we're doing and seeing and learning in our own organizations. And then we're going to have some time following for discussions. So as General Sorensen stated, I'm from ACC Warren in Warren, Michigan. And I have an organization that provides contracting support to the TACOM LCMC that I'm anchored with there. My primary customers are the two big PEOs there, Ground Combat Systems and Combat Support Systems. As well as we have TARDAC on the complex, and I have another big customer, which is INSCOM. So we're busy. And by the very nature of my customers, my main customers, you can see that we do a lot of acquisition systems contracting, and we also do a lot of service sustainment type contracting. What does that mean to you? It means we're doing a lot of source selections. And as I stated, sometimes we get them right, sometimes we get them not so right, and sometimes we're just going as fast as we can to learn what we can and make things right and streamline things. What do we have going on that you're interested in? Well, we started more dialogue and more communication with our industry partners because we're interested in streamlining our process. And that doesn't mean just taking baby steps in the contracting piece of it. That means looking across the entire acquisition lead time. What can we do better? So we're out there, we're tapping you guys for feedback. What we want to know, what don't we do so well? And we're getting a lot of feedback, believe me. And we're incorporating that into some of our processes. What else are we doing? As the boss said, you know, this contracting thing is a team sport. And how do we make it more of a team sport? At Warren, we've integrated our contracting folks, actually integrated, not just co-located, our contracting folks with our major customers. So we want to be in the game early. We don't want the requirement to fall over the wall and then we go, oh, okay, well, now we can start our contracting piece. We want to be there with our customers and we want to be helping them and advising them and developing the strategies and know what's going on. When are we actually going to start this other piece of it so we can shrink that overall acquisition lead time. We are, as I stated, we're in the business of communication now. So most of you, or a lot of you in this room, have been to some of our, we call them industry engagement sessions. All of the centers, the contracting centers, are having these things. We all call them something different because we don't want to copy each other, although we have copied each other. But we're doing that. You guys are coming, you're showing up, we're getting great participation, and we're getting a lot of feedback at those sessions as well. That helps in our, as far as we go as analyzing our process, and it helps for us to get information out to you. Because this is really, it's not a mystery. Our processes aren't a big mystery. It's seemingly so, but really, we just want to get the information out. We want you to know what we're doing behind the closed doors. And then we're advocating for more face-to-face discussions in our source selection. So during those discussion periods, when you're getting the ENs and the INs, we want to have more of that face-to-face discussion time versus just doing it by email or on paper or electronic means. Louisa brought up a good suggestion about consistency, and we are getting that feedback as well. We don't have consistency throughout our source selections or our RFPs. In many cases, it's hard for you to find in the areas of our RFPs where your instructions are or what the requirement is. So we're looking across the board, seeing if we can standardize some of that. And that's just not at ACC Warren. As parks, at all of the centers, we're talking now. So we know what we're all doing, and we know where we don't have consistency. And headquarters is helping us create that across the enterprise. Criteria, we're starting to streamline our criteria. At least we're looking at it. We know that we had, in major acquisition systems, it's complex, and you are gonna have some complex criteria. It's not all gonna be the same, but where we can streamline, we will streamline, and we need your help in that as well. So I don't want to take up all the time, so I'm gonna pass it over to my co-workers.
All right, John, go ahead.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, General Sorensen. I want to build on what General Simpson said and Ms. Greening said. This is a very distinguished group here. So I'm going to give you my context and sort of my view from the foxhole, and then leave the rest of the time for the discussion. I've got a pen here because I'm going to try to learn something here while I'm at this session. So the context is I'm one of 3 parks that worked for Mr. Stuart Hazlett at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We're a 34,000 person organization. Majority of them are engineers and scientists. There's only 5% contracting staff. So Big A acquisition is every day, all day at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and we like it that way. So we do. Army Corps of Engineers has a $27 billion a year budget. About $6 billion of that is civil works. So the mill program side is generally the speed of war in theater piece of that. My park does the work with the centers and also does the downrange work. So that's my experience with generally with the speed of war. But as far as the view from my foxhole, I'm just going to share with you some of the things that I've learned as best practices, things that maybe will generate discussion and feedback as we move forward. So General Simpson mentioned, and Chris, upfront involvement. You can't emphasize that too much. At the extreme, I've seen Army Corps of Engineers use alpha contracting for the Aurora Hospital and for the VA, as well as EC, early contractor involvement, which is used for large military health facilities as well, has been used successfully and has been used with some problems. So those are tools there that at the extreme allow the contracting community to be part of shaping the requirement. When we can't do that, we rely on industry meetings, draft RFPs, pre-proposal meetings, again, to front load industry involvement. You can't emphasize that enough as far as the value. And, before you launch off on a source selection solicitation, you really need to get industry on board so that you're all talking the same thing. Little thing like one-on-one breakout sessions. FAR allows, a lot of contracting folks don't realize that FAR allows one-on-one meetings with the contractors. So you get the discussion in the open forum, and then you get the one-on-one with the contracting community, things that they don't want to say in front of their competitors. So all of those things are great in getting insights and shaping a better solicitation. As far as streamlining review and deliberation times, what we've used successfully is reducing criteria to the significant few. So Pareto applied to the criteria is really important. Mr. Vern Edwards, he would in his course would say, what are the predictors of success, and that's I've always tried to drive to what are the predictors of success, not what are all the things you could review, but what are those criteria that predict success. Past performance obviously is a big part of that. Streamlining review and deliberation times. We like to reduce the criteria, but also reduce the individual reports. So ideally, what we like to see is that we have individual reviews, then we come together, we project the sort of raw form or template of the decision document, and we have very raucous deliberation from all the individual reviewers, and then by the end of the meeting, we have an 80% solution as far as a sort of deliberation document. So what are we getting away from? We're getting away from the consensus documents or the minority reports. We're saying simply driving to what does this team of experts believe is the right selection. We're doing over-the-shoulder reviews at the park level with significant acquisitions. So again, we're part of the review. We're not sitting there waiting for this document to roll in and then judging it. We're part of that deliberation process. General Simpson mentioned complete and concise debriefs. So this is a long-term proposition. So I think we win credibility with industry if we are transparent, and that includes giving them a complete and concise debrief. I mean, by definition, every contractor, every offerer legitimately believes that they're the one, or that they wouldn't be wasting their business development dollars proposing. So, given that they believe that, and we want to respect that we would provide a very concise and complete debriefing, and that I think is a virtuous circle that pays dividends in the long term in a source selection environment. So those are my key points. With that, I'll pass it.
Okay. Alan, if you could kind of give your perspective there from not only the Hill, but certainly industry.
Thank you. Not done until the administrative work is done, right? Thank you. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Very much appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to be here on behalf of 400 members of the Professional Services Council. The PSC focuses a lot on the government-business relationship. We've looked a lot at, recently in the preparation for this session, the Army is changing. What the Army is buying is changing a lot. And it's directly relevant to my focus, which is on the phrase adaptive in the context of source selection. Over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, contracting dollars are down 36% in the U.S. Army. Significant amount of contract spend. And what is being bought, particularly in the services, is also shifting. Although services still make up the majority and almost over 60% of the total Army spend, we don't spend, I don't think we spend enough time on the acquisition of services. Professional administrative services down 6% over the last couple of years. Facility services down. IT is up. Contingency contracting, construction up. The basic rules that I've already talked about a little bit are certainly the same, but in each of these areas, I think it's important to recognize there's some key differences. I want to touch on a few things. I'll ask the basic questions, the who, what, when, where, and how. The what is comes from the outside, certainly the requirements generation side, market research, all of those issues for another panel, but drive what's to be acquired. And I think that's really the starting point for the acquisition side then. Who to acquire for? Early conversations about who do you expect to be competing for this work? And by the way, the Army is doing a very good job on services of competition over 70% of the services acquired over the last 5 or 6 years have been through competitive processes. I spent a long time in industry, and my view of competition is that it was perfect for everybody else, but I would have preferred sole source awards every single time. But nevertheless, in the services environment, we see those competition rates pretty significant and better overall than the department overall. So maybe there's some lessons that sister services can learn from. How to buy. What's the best method to procure many of the goods and services the Army needs? General Simpson touched on the IDIQs. He touched on the individual contracts that are being awarded, and maybe a little less some of the acquisitions from the General Services Administration through the GSA schedules. But those are important questions to ask because they drive important decisions on source selection. What if you didn't use the current source selection processes? We're seeing a lot of growth in alternatives. What if the procurement process was not a FAR 15-based procurement? What happens if we did more work off the schedules? Or as we talked about, Ms. Greening talked about greater use of commercial items and FAR Part 12 procedures. The very different source selection procedures in there. Architects and engineering and construction services that the Corps buys. Different source selection procedures than I think many of us are used to. And what happens if price wasn't a factor at all in the creation of a contract? How would that impact source selection, particularly at contract formation? You know, that's not a wild idea. That's on the invitation that General Sorensen suggested, because that's one of the options, one of the flexibilities the Congress has recently given the department to not use price in the IDIQ contract formation, but to drive it down to at the source selection at the task and delivery order level where the requirements are really understood and the opportunity for pricing. Now that's a flexibility. We're a long way from regulations, and have to repeal 2 before we can put 1 in place either. But here again, I think the Congress is suggesting that there ought to be a different approach to a different way to adapt to source selection than we're many used to. And what happens if we weren't even using a FAR-based procurement at all? And we're seeing a lot of those initiatives as well. Many of you are familiar with the Small Business Innovation Research Program or the broad area announcements, broad agency announcements. Those aren't FAR-based procurements. Other transactions authorities, seeing the growth in that, those aren't FAR-based procurements and require a different type of approach, a different mindset around source selection. And so I think all of those become important. So my bottom line on the source selection is that the acquisition process is an enabler. It's not an end product. We can have the perfect product, but if we're not delivering the goods and services to the warfighter in a timely and effective manner, then we haven't had a success in the acquisition system. In my view, the contracting officer is part of that enabling process, but not an end into itself. And so the measures of success, the contracting process, are not only a compliant contract, but the ability to deliver the goods and services that are required. And many steps will go into that, and we'll welcome the conversation about transparency, about experimentation, and lots of conversations about debriefings and protests that I'll be happy with. But I think here, General, to come back, the Congress is frustrated with the work that the Department of Defense generally and the federal government, the department specifically and the government generally, are doing in the area of moving rapidly to deliver capabilities and technologies to the field. And made almost light of the fact that I've been chairing the Acquisition Reform Working Group since 1993, and we still haven't gotten it right. But that's okay. This is a rapidly evolving process. You know, and if you look at who the top vendors are in the Army, go back as I did to 2010, which was the height of spending in DOD, in particular in the Army. 3 of the top 5 vendors, who were the Army's 3 of the top 5 vendors in 2010, aren't in that top 5 anymore. completely different companies, different working relationships, different delivery of services. I think all of those require a different way to adapt to source selection. And I'll stop with this concept. We need to retool the source selection process to take advantage of both who's delivering the capabilities and the speed at which those capabilities need to be put into the field. And I don't think we're there with our current acquisition system right now. Thank you.
Okay, Alan, thank you. And Tim?
Thank you, General. As the son of a West Point graduate, I can't tell you what a great honor it is to be here today talking to AUSA. This is really cool. Look, I'm also honored to represent DCMA, the Defense Contract Management Agency. If you looked at one of the slides, or first slide that Ms. Greening put up showing the organization, one of the things that's on there is a dotted line to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We are a combat support activity, and that's a key role and responsibility of this agency. We are a force provider. We have people that are currently deployed in theater supporting the troops in the field. In fact, I've got 2 people that are currently on my staff that are going through pre-deployment before they head off to Afghanistan. So we're very proud of the role we play in supporting the United States Army in the field. We do that with quality assurance representatives, property administrators, contract administrators, administrative contracting officers. So it's a huge responsibility, and we don't take that lightly. Before I start my formal comments, I want to commend to you, if you haven't seen it, the latest issue of the Army's AL&T magazine. I got to tell you, it's a great magazine with a lot of really good articles, but there's one in here in particular that talks about keeping contracts from crashing. And it has to do with DCMA's in-plant present at Sikorsky Aircraft. And it talks about when reality strikes in contract administration for Army helicopters, DCMA Sikorsky Aircraft fills in the gaps with real-time information and critical multifunctional expertise. And I think that real-time information and multifunctional expertise really kind of gets to the heart of the mission that Ms. Greening talked about for our agency, which is to provide actionable acquisition insight from the factory floor to the front line. And sometimes that front lines are the buying offices within the department and among the services. DCMA itself has a fairly modest acquisition budget. As Ms. Greening said, the agency has about a $1.4 billion budget overall. Over 85% of that is in our personnel expenses. So that leaves significantly less for products, services, if you will, that we acquire. And we spend just north of $100 million on contract each year. So most of these are for IT support, IT services. We do have some facilities and equipment acquisitions that we buy. And we do, to General Simpson's point earlier, we do utilize existing contract vehicles when and where they're available and they support our need. So the Army Chess contract is one that we do take advantage of. So we aren't doing a lot of source selections as an agency, but I will tell you last year we did do a fairly large source selection, and it had to do with a multiple award IDIQ contract vehicle for MOCAS life cycle improvement. And basically MOCAS is the mechanization of contract administration services system that's used throughout the department and among the services to help us provide the right oversight of our contracts. And that's like a 1950s, 1960 vintage system based in COBOL and whatever. And we really are trying to bring it into the 20th century, much less the 21st. So there's a big effort ongoing there. We're working with DFAS on that, and we went through a rather rigorous source selection process on that. And when Ms. Grady, who is the Director of Defense Procurement and Acquisition Policy, says that on average for the department, source selections take 18 months. I can attest to that. It is a lengthy process. And it's a challenge that exists within the services and the department as to how do we become more agile? How do we streamline the process? How do we get our requirements on contract quicker? How do we make these source selections, insightful so that we get the right contractor under contract in a very reasonable period of time? For DOD and the services with regard to source selection, DCMA is, I'd like to say, we're an information resource for the buying offices. We don't staff or provide augmentation on a full-time basis to source selection teams among the services and buying activities. That's really not our responsibility. It's certainly not what we're resourced to do. But we do provide support to source selections, and we do that through a number of different ways. Part of what we do is, and Ms. Greening talked about it, early acquisition involvement is something that we really are beating the drums for our workforce to be involved, to be aware of what the services are planning to buy, engage the buying offices early, bring our lessons learned from existing contracts to the follow-on efforts or to new efforts, bring our experience to the table. If we can influence the contract line item structure or the clauses, you heard Ms. Greening talk some of that, inspection acceptance, where should that take place? Why should it take place in a certain area? What type of surveillance is going to be required? What contract type is most effective for what's being bought? Those are types of insights and assistance we can provide. Again, there'll be recommendations to the buying activities. They'll be the ones that make the final decision. And we can certainly help with market research. We have within our agency an industry analysis center that has really kind of a market-based approach in what they are looking at as to what companies are active in that market, how viable are they, is there more than one? That becomes really important, particularly when you're talking at the subcontract level, because a lot of the primes are going to be using the same subs to support their proposal. So there's some really interesting lash-ups and relationships there. So we can provide some insight and assistance that way. We can help with responsibility and capability assessments of the various offers. We can do that through pre-award surveys, or we can assess the technical capabilities or the capacity of individual offerers. We can help with that. We have a small group in our Cost and Pricing Center that does financial capability reviews. And this group really are experts in delving into the books, if you will. They can look at the contractor's cash flow. They can look at their acid test ratio. They can look at their revenue stream. They can really provide insight from a risk management standpoint as, does this particular offer have the wherewithal and the resources to be able to perform the contract if it's awarded to them? So we have that capability. We provide, as mentioned, cost and pricing support. We can do that out of our Cost and Pricing Center. We provide proposal pricing support. We have about 500 people that are dedicated to that function. When I came on board about 6 years ago, that was only about 100 people. So we have significantly grown that capability as it's recognized that this is really value to the department if we can understand contractors' proposals, how they build their proposals, what costs go into it, so that we are assuring ourselves and our customers that they're getting a fair and reasonable price. Our ICATs, we have a limited number of those with contractors that have multiple major proposals in any given year, $250 million and up proposals. And so we have a number of ICATs that really have that in-depth insight into the specific contractors. And then within the contract management offices, we have a number of contract administrators and cost and price analysts that do the mid-tier and lower tier contractors support. So we can talk about realism, we can talk about rates, we can talk about what, the skill mix and those type of things in contractor proposals. Past performance input is something that we absolutely have insight into and can provide. This is the factory floor insight that we have. We do that on major weapon systems through our program assessment reports that we provide up to ATNL. But we also provide input to program offices and program managers for their CPARS reports. And we'll also respond to questionnaires from various source selection teams that are considering particular contractors and want to know what their track record has been in terms of quality or schedule performance, cost control, management, and even small business. How effective are they in their subcontracting plan? How well do they follow through on their commitments to award subcontracts to small business? And one last area, and then I'll relinquish, is business systems. Ms. Greening talked about them. There are 6 business systems that our ACOs will review and approve or disapprove: accounting, estimating, material management, property, purchasing, and earned value. So those are systems, and some of those systems, if you don't have an approved system or an accounting system that's approved, or at least a system that has been determined by DCAA to be, you can rely upon their ability to capture costs. Contractors may not be eligible to compete for particular requirements. So that insight we maintain in a thing called the Contractor Business System Repository, CBAR. We have information in there about individual contractor systems by case code. We also have their CAS disclosure statements. And so there's a lot of information. To circle back to the point that I made earlier, we are an information resource for the buying activities, and we can provide a lot of insight to help give the buying activities what they need to make an informed decision as to who they award a contract to through the source selection process.
Okay, Tim, thank you. So I want to congratulate the panel for not taking the entire time for the panel to have the discussion. And they did very well in terms of leaving sufficient time here for questions. So we received a few questions, but clearly, there's a lot more that probably could be asked. So please send cards and letters. And I guess we also have folks online, so I don't know how we're generating those questions as well. So hopefully we're getting their input as well. So if they've got some questions, we'll add those as well. Okay, well, the opportunity to ask questions is there. So I'm going to start with Ms. Mendoza. She's got a question here. Actually, 2 questions, but they're kind of combined. And so I'm going to have her sort of read it and then provide some commentary.
Okay, so just so you know, this panel thing probably holds more value for me than for you. I mean, I'm going to answer questions if I can answer the questions, but really it's about you giving us feedback up here too on what we're doing and what kind of processes we're using. So these 2 questions that I have are related to the integration with our customers. How long have contract staff been co-located and integrated with customers, and what, if any, improvements has the change caused? Have relationships between operations and contracts improved? Yes, they have improved, and let me tell you that sometimes this integration thing is a little bit painful, and you all have experience with it most likely. So what improvements has it caused, or what changes has it made? So we are getting in the game earlier. We are in the game when the requirements are being developed, and we're able to offer advice, and in as much as acquisition strategy, what kind of criteria should be used if it's going to be competed, are we going to be sole sourcing the contract, but also generally across the board, we're getting more of an understanding of the entire acquisition process. So in years past, if you were a part of all of this, and most of you were, you would notice that there was this piece that was kind of upfront piece that was, they were calling it acquisition lead time, and then there was the piece that was procurement administration lead time, and that is, we commonly refer to that as PULP. The 2 separate things. As we started integrating our teams, we realized that's just really one big, long process. And so we're beginning to understand that. It's a team sport. We all have a piece to play in it. Now, contracting is learning a little bit more about what this upfront piece is, and the upfront requirements generators are realizing what this back piece is, the contracting piece, and how it's all regulated and what we have to do to make improvements. So that's the major improvement there. The second question is also related to the integration, and it is how do you ensure the business decision independence of your contracting personnel who are co-located with the PEOs? Have you had any problems with PEO personnel attempting to influence a source selection? So some of you who are PEOs, who wouldn't? I mean, who wouldn't attempt to influence a source selection? So recognizing that not all of our teams can be integrated. We do this with our major customers and with our major programs. We can't do it across the board because, as General Simpson had stated, we have a lot of contracting personnel that have less than 10 years experience. Am I going to put them out there all alone on their own? No, I'm not going to, because they'll flounder. They won't have anyone to support them. They won't have any training. But where our major programs are and where I have experienced people, that integration piece works like a charm. It really does. So what have I had any trouble, and what do I do to prevent it? Well, the integration piece makes my job a little bit harder. I have to be very vigilant about it, and I have to make sure that my contracting people are always on board with me, knowing that they're supported by Army Contracting Command and that it's always being reported through me. It also creates another dynamic with myself, between myself and the PEOs. They have to be on board with me too and know how our process works and know that they can't be influencing source selections. So far so good. But just be aware that we remain vigilant about that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question here that's kind of for the entire panel, but I'm going to, in many cases, turn it over to John and maybe to have Chris comment on it as well. It says, all speakers have discussed the importance of communication and collaboration among industry, contracting, and customers. Finding many contracting organizations are cutting off communications when RFIs are issued. The FAR suggests RFP release. Should there be better guidance provided to contracting centers to ensure uniformity and alignment with senior leader intent? The point being, when do you cut off the communications? John?
Yeah,
A little scary that I'm giving them guidance.
yeah,
after I
really.
did something.
Yeah, I'm supposed to be from the engineering command, right?
It's adaptive learning is what it is.
I mean, that's a you know, it depends kind of question. I guess you have to rely on experience and just sort of how you start that dialogue. Every industry event, I have one of my analysts travel to the event and get a read of the crowd and the quality of the interaction. Is it crickets, or is there lively dialogue and a lot of substantial feedback? I think I would say that with enough experience, you sort of know when you have gotten to that point. One thing I'd like to say is, technology. Huntsville Engineering Center has just done something really cool, which is a virtual industry day. So they're doing a O&M requirement for all the guard centers across the nation. They had 150, mostly small businesses, tune in virtually, kind of like with this session, and they had a very rigorous discussion and exchange, all done online. So, again, I don't know that there's any exact answer, but basically, if you've done, what you think, and then a few layers in addition to that, I think you can pretty much feel for when you kind of got the dialogue played out?
So we're changing things up a little bit. I think that over the years we've, just by the very nature of the way that we're procuring at such a high op tempo, that maybe we weren't communicating as well as we should have. We're trying to change that. So we're trying not to limit our communications with industry in as much as we can. When it starts to be procurement sensitive, of course we must, but we're trying to enhance our communications with these industry days, our draft RFPs, our industry engagement sessions, our pulse sessions, or we always call them some different thing, but we also, I know at the centers, we also are starting to encourage more open dialogue with industry as well. And so I'm saying I have an open door policy where I will engage with you if you call me or want to come and visit, and I think the other center directors do as well.
General, if I can just add, because I want to help Mr. Tetzlaff with his answer, I think the right answer is it never ends. The techniques vary. If you're pre-award, it's going to vary. If you're in the middle of source selection, the communication techniques are going to vary. If you're post-award, you still want those communications. I think the right answer is communication should never stop on either the government side or the industry side.
Yeah, and I think in many cases it depends in terms of who you can communicate, but I would agree. The communication should be there. Alan, I sent you a little card there with respect to congressional actions. Would you provide some comment on that as well?
Sure. It was a simple question. How do I, the Professional Services Council, view the change to the Office of the Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics that was mandated in the 17 NDAA? Good, Kristen. So PSC rarely takes positions on the department's organizational design. But we did communicate to the Congress some concerns. First of all, in my own view, organizational design rarely creates problems and rarely solves the problems that you're trying to fix. And often, as I've found, it tends to create new problems that you hadn't anticipated. I think more importantly, this particular issue reflects a frustration by the Congress of how the department was approaching acquisition, where leadership was coming from, and how the Congress was to be kept informed. And the solution was to focus on the frustration about the ability of the department to deliver technology and rapid capabilities to the field instead of focusing on an enormous bureaucracy within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Remember, the 17 bill was the second year of an initiative because in 16, the Congress directed the Office of the Secretary of Defense to get out of the way of a lot of the procurement policies in the government and push that back into the military departments. But I think there's going to have to be, we're beginning to see even the initial report on implementation from the department, an artificial separation of functions. And I'm concerned that some of the functions just don't naturally fit into acquisition and sustainment or research and engineering, and may have to either be duplicated or those offices are going to have to find a way to integrate themselves in order to solve that. I would have preferred to address either the real or the perceived issues by getting at those real or perceived issues rather than creating a different organizational design. I hope the department, I know the department is taking that issue seriously. The Secretary of Defense is certainly engaged, as is the Bob Work, the Deputy Secretary, for performing the duties of until the new Deputy Secretary comes in. I hope Congress would be open to revisiting that before too long.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to switch a little bit over here to DCMA perspective. Tim, I've sent you a couple notes there as well in terms of questions. One relatively simple, but the other one a little more complex.
I've got four, so if I'll just talk to one and then we'll circle back. And if I don't get to your question, please see me at the break. The first question I got had to do with more and more often PCOs are handling ACO responsibilities versus using DCMA. Why is this change occurring? And then is there any benefit or downside to separation of PCO and ACO duties? Without knowing specifically what duties or responsibilities are being shifted, it's kind of hard to answer that question directly. But I will tell you, we do have a couple of things going on. One, we have a workload acceptance process within the agency. And when a contract is delegated to us, we do a contract receipt and review, and we look to see whether or not that's a contract that is within our core competency and within our responsibility under FAR Part 42 to perform the administration of. We do have an exclusion for performing base, post, camper, station contracting work. That's just not something that's in our charter, and it's not something we're resourced to do. The other has to do with some exceptions, administering service contracts. We're more hardware in the plant as a general rule, and that's kind of where our expertise and sweet spot happens to be. And it goes to the issue of factory floor insight. One of the reasons that the separation of PCO and ACO responsibilities, if you will, or at least why there's a good reason for some of that to exist, is when you're in a particular contractor's facility, we'll administer contracts for the Army, for the Air Force, for the Navy, for other government agencies. So while we're there, we have the insight. We know the contractor, the contractor's personnel, the processes, their procedures. We have a consistent approach, and it also is helps manage resources for the department. It wouldn't make sense for each individual service or activity to have their own contract admin folks out there doing surveillance in a particular contractor's facility. It would also, I think, be very confusing to the contractor to have to deal with different individuals interpreting the FAR or the contract clauses different ways. So that's, I guess, my basic answer to this question, but I'd be glad to speak to details at the break.
Okay, Tim, thanks. So we're going to shift a little bit here to what is a question for both John and Chris. In the spirit of continuous improvement efforts, the DoD and the OSD wide, how does your organization drive or collaborate within the Lean CI programs underway at TACOM or the Corps of Engineers? John, or I guess John. Go ahead.
I'm not aware of any formal involvement with leaning processes or Lean Six Sigma, but I mean, I think we do leaning kind of at a tactical level with every acquisition that we deal with, but I'm not aware of any formal process.
Okay.
So we have a couple of black belt projects going on right now to get after this acquisition lead time thing and to develop better acquisition strategies. One is in conjunction with PEO, Ground Combat Systems, where we're looking at the entire acquisition lead time, mapping it all out and seeing where we can streamline the process in order to shorten it and condense it. The other is in conjunction with DLA, and that is to see if we can develop better strategies where we are competing for sources for repair, parts, and sustainment activities that we can join together and develop better acquisition strategies and strategic sourcing mechanisms. So we've got those two things going on, but I'd enjoy any other suggestions on things that you think we should look at as well.
So it's just staying a little bit on that theme. There was a question that came in for Chris here. Describe briefly, starting with TRADOC, how an Army ground combat system procurement lands on the KO's desk.
Yeah, it's magical.
Pixie dust.
Yeah, and there is no way to describe it briefly, so I'm gonna like condense that too and kind of get from the, our major customers to the KO's desk. So like, there's a lot of magical things going on up here, and a bunch of time goes by, and it goes through decision points, and then it, and the PEO is involved in it all that time, when it finally lands in their area as a, let's just say, new requirement, a new requirement. A new requirement comes to the PEO. We're aware because we're co-located and we're integrated with them. It's coming down the pike. We're under a CR, so no new starts. And have you ever tried to not start a program that needs to start because you're under a CR? It's pretty tricky. But in as much as that, so it's there, we're discussing all of the milestones and all of the acquisition strategies and all of the upfront documents that have to be prepared, and where those are going to occur over the timeline with the PEO right from the start when we're integrated with them on these major programs. So especially the ground combat system. Like I said, we now have the Black Belt project that is ongoing. So when those requirements are coming through, we're also considering those in our Black Belt project and the information that we're using there to try and streamline that whole process. And so it's not like an over the fence, throw it over, we just learn about the requirement and then we start contracting. We're right there at the very beginning. I hope that answers.
Okay, great. So continuing with that particular discussion in terms of how this gets done, here's a question with respect to lead times. Source selection lead times have grown over the past few years at a time when we need rapid support. Mr. Callahan said it takes up to 18 months on average. Why does this take so long, and what should be the goal? 9 months? 6 months? John?
Yeah, it's sort of a follow-on. Although there's not a formal Lean Six, yesterday senior leaders at USACE we met, and we finally have a tool that will track all-in acquisition lead time. And as simple as that might sound, in an enterprise as large as USACE, it's not so simple. So measuring it, I think, is a big start of figuring out how to lean it, but going back to my initial points, where it drags on is because I think the front end part does not get done, where the source selection involves tweaking and readjusting the requirement. The telltale is when you see more than 10 amendments, something's probably wrong, and it just goes on and on and on. Too much time in deliberation. I think there's sort of a cultural thing where people think that source selections are some sort of a ceremony as opposed to a business process where you try to get to the end result. I think some of it's cultural, but again, streamlining, reducing the boards, getting rid of factor boards, flattening the source selection organizations. If that doesn't happen and it becomes very hierarchical and, a long and drawn out deliberation process. That's why it's taken too long, in my opinion. But it is an active part of what we're working on. When General Richardson, talked to his Army, senior Army contracting leadership, we got the message loud and clear, and, we were working on that before that. But it's a tough problem, but, it's down to the details of each source selection, and you got to have the focus on the front end. You got to have the deliberation and leadership, at the ground level that's driving this. I mean, it's you can do all the lean Six Sigma processes you want, but if there's not a leader on the ground making that happen, it won't happen. Over.
Chris, you want to?
Can I just add briefly that just as a reminder, industry isn't sitting around praying that you get done more quickly. So this is another good example of where communications, constant communications back. If the source selection process was, you had a target date and everybody understands an award date in May 1st, and it's going to slip to June or July 1st, communicate that. It's going to take longer because sooner or later you're going to come back to the industry. You're going to ask them to extend their proposals, extend their pricing. Are new people available? And the longer these processes take, there are related problems, issues, and risk that arise both from the government side as well as the industry side.
So continuing on that theme, I want to give Ms. Mendoza a commentary there for how to speed things up. But before we get to that, so Alan, I got a question here about just as a follow-up from Redstone. It says, what can industry do to assist with reducing time to award contracts like IDIQs? So what can industry do?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that industry can do. They are following these procurements for a long time. You no doubt have the knock on the door from lots of business development folks and former colleagues trying to understand the process. Tighter requirements and greater communications, I think, will lead to better industry proposals, and you should hold the industry accountable for those better industry proposals. We ought to actually see more awards done without discussions. I'm a big fan of that. If companies were to begin to see the patterns from agencies of awarding without discussions and expecting best pricing the first time around, multiple rounds of proposal activity aren't helpful to the industry. They're not helpful, and they're expensive both for government and industry. So in the first instance, clearer requirements, a clearer set of evaluation and fewer evaluation standards, and then holding the industry accountable for getting their best proposal in the first time, I think would help to shrink the process a little bit.
Okay. And Chris, any comments about shortening the cycle?
So not every source selection takes 18 months, but I'll tell you that the complex ones sometimes take 18 months. When we prioritize and we can focus our teams on a source selection, we can shrink that time like nobody's business. But we don't have that luxury, right? So it's not that when we're talking about a team sport, this isn't just about contracting and shrinking the time for source selections. It's about everybody's resources and can they dedicate it to a team for source selection. So we're trying to get after that, but just be aware that sometimes 18 months it's okay. Add changing requirements into that because we change our mind all the time on what we want. So we get a source selection out there, we've got the RFP, we're asking you for your proposals, and we're changing our mind at the same time. And we will change our mind up until the very last minute, I'm telling you, we will. So we're trying to get after that too. But really, it's kind of one of those situations that we're always going to have those factors.
So speaking of changing your mind, at industry engagement sessions for opportunities not yet in the PALT, does the government describe the problems to be solved and what's not working well? And that's not working well currently. If you start with the requirements as understood by the government, it leaves no room for industry innovation. We need to see the whole picture, and that's the problem that we need to have solved.
So that's a great suggestion, and it's clearly not a question, it's really a suggestion on the way we do business, and we are trying to make some changes to that too. That is very true, that we should be more open about our communications and what we think we need or the problem that we think should be solved rather than telling you, here's how you need to solve it for us. I agree.
So Tim, I had sent you a few other points down there. Like I said, one was pretty simple, the other a little bit more complex. If you want to go ahead and...
Certainly. Do we have a question about a business system? It says, is there an online site to get more info on what will be reviewed by DCMA on the 6 systems? I know what DCAA audits and the programs they follow. What does DCMA follow? Well, first of all, of the 6 business systems, DCAA is prime on 3 of them: accounting, estimating, and material management accounting system. DCMA is prime for earned value, property, and purchasing systems. So I'm not going to talk to DCAA and what they audit to. I think that's pretty straightforward. As far as DCMA, what we look at, for each of these business systems, there is a contract clause, and each of those clauses will tell you what the criteria is for an acceptable business system. Now, for DCMA, particularly with our purchasing system, on our website, you can go to that website, and we host our job guide for contractor purchasing system reviews. So there's no secret. The kind of checklist is there. There's no magic handshake. It's there. If you are complying with or can respond to those particular criteria and questions, it shouldn't be an issue. The other question I had, which was interesting, it says it remains important that we maintain oversight balance within the acquisition process. DCMA used to focus significant energy on insight versus oversight. Is DCMA still focused on insight and working to maintain oversight balance? I think that's really an interesting question. It goes to some degree to what Ms. Greening talked about in terms of detection to prevention, and the fact that we are trying to back away from some of the intrusive oversight, if you will, and provide more of the insight, more of the prevention, if you will, assessing contractor systems rather than inspecting individual parts. And so it was interesting. Just yesterday we had an agency-wide senior leader council meeting, and there was talk about the quality workforce, and really had to do with our quality assurance folks and how they're spending their time. And the statistics that were briefed from a sample that we did was about 40% of a quality assurance individual's time is spent on product evaluation. We have I don't want to say a goal, but a desire to reduce that and spend more time on, the insight and evaluation of systems. And if we could reduce that time spent on product evaluation, we think we will be more effective and more efficient in utilizing our resources. So yes, there is within DCMA a desire and an intent to spend more time on the prevention side rather than the detection side of the business.
Okay, with that, I heard the buzz go off. It's better than a hook. But I just want to finalize some comments and closure here with respect to the panel. First of all, I'd like to thank all the panel members for their comments and commentary as well for the questions. I thought that was very informative. I guess I would like to end with what I stated to begin with. Stephen Covey said it best: begin with the end in mind. This is something that's really important in terms of source selection. And I think if you understood what the panel was talking about today, they're asking you to continue to collaborate, to continue to talk and engage with the contracting commands. There's a lot of collaboration taking place amongst the ACCs. And just like you walk through the airport, if you see something that's not consistent, say something. Bring it up to somebody and make sure that there's communications across the board, as well as what Alan said as well, continue to communicate throughout the entire process. The next thing I would say is don't expect miracles. This is a very challenging and complex effort, and that everybody that I think is certainly sitting at this table has put their best foot forward to continue to assist the contracting agencies, the procurement of capability to support the warfighter, and appreciate everything they do, and thanks again for their time. So thank you.